Now, I've lived quite a long time, and in that time things have bound to have happened in my life, and some of them have been amusing, some less so. So there are a couple of stories about my childhood years, which I spent largely in the company of my brother Keith. He was 18 months older than me, and it showed. The first thing is the peculiar happening at Which Cross at the Hollow Pond. I don't know whether you know the Hollow Pond, but it's a very large pond. It's near Which Cross Hospital, and it's a sort of place where, as children, we often spend a lot of time riding bikes when we shouldn't have done, and so on. But Keith said to me one day, he said, let's go over to the Hollow Pond. Now, it's been very, very cold indeed, been frost and snow about. He said, if we go over to the pond, we can walk across the ice to the islands in the pond, which we can't normally get to. So I said, well, yeah, all right, sounds a good idea, so off we went. We got to the Hollow Pond, and Keith said to me, I suppose he was about 10 at that time, and I was about 8. He said to me, you go on first and test it, you're lighter than I am. So on I went, 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps in. Now, at that stage, I was in short trousers, and the water was icy cold, and it went straight right up to my knees. Anyway, I managed to get out of the pond, and we had to consider then what to do next. And we didn't think it was a terribly good idea to go back home in that state. So Keith said, let's get on a tram. So that's what we did. We got on a tram at Which Cross that was going to Aldgate. Went upstairs and sat down at the front. The conductor came up. He looked at me and said, what have you been doing? And I explained my dilemma. And he said, be back in a moment. He went downstairs and came back with a big armful of newspapers that he tried to dry the socks as best he could, and the shoes. And then he took them downstairs and put them on the controller's resistance box that got quite hot. So by the time we got to Aldgate, we went downstairs, the socks were still wet, but nothing like they were. And the shoes too, they were drier than they were. But even at that point, we decided that we wouldn't go home. We got all-day tickets on the trams, and we rode around on them all day. When he eventually got home in the evening, the socks were almost dry, and the shoes didn't look too bad. And there were no repercussions from that, really, except that my father said to me the next day, oh, I've had the dickens of a job to get any shine on your shoes. What have you been doing with them? But, I mean, this was something that actually happened, and it's something that couldn't happen today, could it? I mean, in the first place, there aren't conductors on trams and buses, and in the second place, in these days, they wouldn't dare to go to a young lad and do things like that. And I think really in many ways we are the poorer. Now the next incident was a trip across to, it was to Dorothy and Vera. You saw Dorothy on the film there. It's unfortunate that Vera wouldn't come because she would know all about this story, because Keith and I went across to Greenford where they lived. When we got there, Dorothy said to me, she said, oh, we've agreed to go on a picnic with our schoolgirl friends. And then she thought for a moment, she said, well, you can come if you like. So Keith and I thought about it. We couldn't really see a downside to going out with a group of girls onto Horsham Hill for a picnic. So we were pleased to do that, which we did. But during the picnic meal, a plate got broken. And Keith and I kicked up a terrific shindy about it. We said, Paul, if this great carelessness can be trouble, there's going to be very big trouble over this. You've broken a tea plate of one of Dorothy's mother's best tea services. And anyway, they got over that. Anyway, in the evening, this girl's mother came round and she said to Dorothy's mother, well, she was, shall we say, she was almost abject in her apologies about this. But afterwards, she said, but you know, I do think that perhaps you were a little unwise in letting these girls take out your best tea service. Best tea service, blood, she said. That was only an old plate, it was already cracked. But anyway, there were no repercussions. We still seem to be reasonable favour, because Dorothy and Vera and Valerie were the three girls' cousins, and their father always wanted boys, and really we put a foot wrong. Whatever we did wrong, Dorothy got the blame. So there we are, that's that. Now, is it time for another one or not?
Go on then, one more.
One more, right. So let's go to more mature years. We lived at Thaden Boys, but it was a semi-detached house, 3 bedrooms, which I converted one of the large ones into 2 rooms. So the 3 boys had a bedroom each. And we tried hard to get permission to extend the house, and it didn't seem to come. And anyway, after that, there was the problem where to park the cars, because I had one, Eileen had one, Paul had one, and I think Michael had one, and at times he might have had 2 when he was selling one and buying another. So I said to Eileen one Saturday morning, I said, look, let's get out of this, let's go out and buy a house. She said, where? I said, well, in the Guardian, there's one advertised in Harlow, backing onto the golf course. It's in a very nice position. So we went to look at that. And it was a nice house and it was a nice location, but the problem was that to get it to the 4th bedroom you had to go through the 3rd. So we didn't think much of that. So Eileen said, no, what are we going to do? I said, well, I saw a house advertised in the Guardian at Matching Green. She said, have you got the papers? So I said, no. I said, but I remember what it looked like. Matching Green isn't very big, so let's go and have a look. Which we did. I knocked on the door, said, could we look over the house? And the chap said, well, it's not really very convenient. So he said, I'll tell you what, come back in 10 minutes and you can have a look over it. So we went back, looked over it, and I said, right, we'll have it. And it was just like that. So when we went home, about midday, we decided to buy a house, and we'd actually bought one. We were back home again. I thought not many people could move as fast as that. Well, that's my 3rd one, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Up next is Derek.
I made a few notes while Mike was speaking earlier on, because I thought I'd start off by trying to embellish the excellent report that he gave, although it's very difficult, I can tell you. One thing in particular, we spoke about Auntie Dolly and Uncle Ted, and he said that Uncle Ted was getting this splendid salary of £450 a year when they got married, I believe.
1948 that was.
48, oh, well, it's later. Yes, anyway, she told me once that she was working in an office in London, and when she announced she was getting married, they said, oh, well, we don't keep married women on the staff, you'll have to leave. So she said, oh, well, all right then, fair enough. And he said, mind you, he said, I'm very surprised you want to leave, because I was going to get you a special rise this year. He said, I was going to get you £7 this year instead of the usual 5. And he thought that would put her off the idea of marriage. So it shows how times do change. can't read my own writing here. Oh yes, one other thing that arose out of Mike's talk was the reference to Cumberland. Because about 40 years ago, I went with Sylvia to hospital when she had an appointment there at Wanstead Hospital. And we walked into the waiting room and we sat down, and another couple walked in and sat down as well. And the receptionist came out and she said, "Right, Mrs. Routledge, please." And you've guessed it, they both got up and went up to the counter. So I said to Sylvia, "You better make sure you get the right operation." Anyway, we spoke to them afterwards and said what a coincidence it was, and they said, "Oh, nothing the slightest bit unusual about that. We come from Cumberland, it's teeming with them." So there we are. I've got one or two amusing items to mention, but I have to say that my early life was absolutely totally dominated by the war situation. The war, I suppose all my formative years really were spent in war conditions. And that one way in which it illustrates how it affected our lives was, I can remember going on holiday as a family in 1938. I can remember all of us going down to Cromer, I think it was, and we stayed with the Mrs. Bishop. Do you remember Mrs. Bishop?
I remember that, yeah.
Shows it's genuine. And, but then we didn't go on any more holidays until after the war, and of course by then, I'm not going to talk about people's ages, but by then people like Bernard had grown up, he didn't come on family holidays in quite the same way. So I was sort of left like an only child then. But there are one or two amusing items that occurred. One that particularly comes to mind is that when the bombing started, we didn't go down the air raid shelter straight away. We tried to brave it out in the house for a bit. And I had a very near miss actually on one occasion. It was very soon after we decided to go down to the air raid shelter, a bomb came through the roof and went right through my bed. Now, you've probably heard of this. People in those days used to be very fatalistic, and they used to say, well, if a bomb's got your name on it, there's nothing you can do about it. But other people used to talk about guardian angels. And I felt I had the two in one there because, you know, the bomb got my name on it, it went right through my pillow. But, fortunately, I wasn't there. Somebody took me out of the way. So that was one thing. But another thing that was particularly amusing, I thought, was because we didn't go down the air raid shelter straight away, my father put a number of us in a row to sleep under this big oak table that we had in our dining room. Of course, the two big worries were flying glass and buildings collapsing on top of you. And we were lying there like sardines, all protected by this table. And I suddenly had a nightmare. I suppose it was a rather strange circumstances. I sat up very sharply, and I'm not mentioning any names, but the two people either side of me both sat up sharply. Of course, because they were taller than I was, they banged their heads on the table. As I say, I'm not mentioning any names. Just one other thing that I find very amusing when I look back on it is, right at the end of the war, we were allowed to have a Guy Fawkes bonfire again, and so we celebrated locally, and we had a massive bonfire on the green right outside the house of a chap I was very friendly with at the time, and we spent ages setting it all up and building up to a huge height, but we had terrible weather. And the war had only been over a few months, and it rained and rained and rained, and on the night they couldn't get it lighted because nobody was prepared to hand over any petrol or anything like that. They tried all sorts of things, and at one stage they said they were going to give it up. But one bloke there said, I've got something that will get it started. So he went home, and when he came back, you won't believe this, he had an unexploded bomb with him. He was convinced it was an incendiary bomb, but I must admit I wasn't as convinced as he was. And I was able to creep off down the road and hide behind a tree until the fire got going. But he was right, it was an incendiary bomb. I thought none of the houses would have any windows in them when I came. But have I still got a couple of minutes? Two incidents I remember are related. One day I was out in the garden and a very sandy-coloured plane came over, and it was an Oster, which was, I think, it was a British make. It was certainly made by the Allies, and it started circulating round and round. And I worked out, I was very young at the time, it was circulating round the Halex place. Now, we've always suspected, both then and now, that a lot of secret work came out of that factory. And I easily realised this was a British plane that had been captured by the Germans, but it was being used for reconnaissance purposes. It had no guns on it and absolutely no markings. It was amazing to find a plane with no markings at all flying around over London. And anyway, on this one occasion, the thing that I remember particularly about it is that all the guns started firing at once before the air raid warning went off, which was very rare. Of course, you had to have the air raid warning first because you had all this falling shrapnel, all these shells bursting, and you got great big slivers of white hot metal dropping out of the sky, jagged fragments. And the other thing was, my mother and I were coming home from the shops, which were about half a mile away, on another occasion, and we were loaded up with shopping, and we suddenly heard some planes coming over very low. They were obviously very, very low in the sky, roaring away, and we were standing there waiting for them to come over the tops of the trees so we could see what the markings were on them. And before they got to us, we never actually saw the aircraft, but suddenly it happened again. All the guns suddenly opened up at once, and then the air raid siren went off, and we were stranded out in the open, and it was raining shrapnel. So my mother never forgot that and often reminded me of it. So I know my time is up. I've got plenty more to say, but thank you for listening so far anyway.
One thing I didn't say about Derek's mother is that before she was married, she worked in a typing firm, an insurance company in London. And I didn't know, but she was very good at Spanish, all the Spanish stuff that came in. She was the person that was given to deal with it, so she was obviously gifted in the Spanish language, so that's just an interesting point to put in there. So, our third and final memories of the day are from Brian.
Pleasure to greet you all now as part of the family, because over many years one has heard about this person and you hear about that, and to try and put it in a totally coherent form is very difficult. And Michael and I have been in exchange of what's called emails, and Michael said to one of his, well, do you think you could keep them talking for an hour just to finish the proceedings? And so, you see, I had to get my script together for an hour. I timed it very precisely. But actually, that's simple. Derek had a note, and I've always had a note at meetings because there's always the topic you might forget. And I'm very cognizant of Churchill's advice to Anthony Eden when he said to him, look, Anthony, hold a piece of paper before you, because those who are listening will think you've thought about it. Well, I have thought about this rather hard, because Michael asked for a few amusing stories. Now I see the programme is interesting times or something, or interesting news.
Yeah, that comes on.
And so I find interesting use more appropriate, because it is actually quite fascinating to recognise that it's just over a century ago that the widow of my great-grandfather, on his death in 1910, came for a break out to the countryside of Essex and spent a spell in High Easter, which I gather is just a bit further down the road.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And there is a member of the family to whom this lady brought back a mug on which it says, "A present from High Easter." And believe me, it is still in the family and regularly, I'm sure, looked after. In essence, this is the first family gathering, I believe, for some 70 years, since in the 1930s, our Uncle George and Aunt Vera, who lived in South Woodford, regularly gave garden parties and Christmas parties, particularly on Boxing Day, when the family were invited. They were great socialites and very pleasant, and Uncle George was also connected strongly with St Mary's Church in South Woodford. I met him once, charming man, but equally I can understand the leader who set the Chartered Institute of Secretaries on course. At that time, there were various photographs taken, and I'm one of 2 or 3 others who were then but a babe in arms. And it's interesting to look back and see how one's parents, aunts and uncles were all so young and sprightly, rushing around the tennis courts as they did. Simplicity in those days. I don't know whether you know, but our great-grandfather, that's my great-grandfather, I must be careful because we've got the generational gap, Charles Williams, who was born in 1844, was born on the very day that the Royal Exchange in the City of London was opened. And so for many years I used to walk past this building thinking nothing of it other than it's just a few more yards to the station, until I then read a little bit about family history and came across this very interesting statement. I thought we ought to have a plaque now, but nothing's happened as yet. But he married a young lady of 19 who was actually a cousin. And I'm not, there are views on cousins marrying cousins, I believe. He married Elizabeth Ann Farrow, which is a rather unusual name, and I'd be very interested to know any information that there is on the background of that. I don't know how common it is today. And they took a small house in Walthamstow, in which they stayed for 42 years, bringing up 9 children. And being the sort of person I was when my father was alive and living in that part of the world, I asked, I'd like to go and see that house. And so we spent the Sunday afternoon walking down to look at it. Part of a terrace with an archway between, which fits what you were saying a little earlier. But the amenities in those days were so limited. So how the poor wife Elizabeth survived keeping everything under control in such a restricted area, I don't know. And it's one of the things that makes me at times realise how fortunate we are. And we don't always accept it. But look back to our own family and see how they managed it. My grandfather, that's Charles William II, as I call him, appears to have had more fortune in life, since his father was a clerk with some solicitors in the city, but his son became a company registrar at a comparatively early age, because in the 1901 census it tells us that there were 2 children only in the family, Percy and his sister Doris. The company which he was with was called Linotype, which may be totally unfamiliar to you. But Linotype was a dominant force in the printing industry, as it was able, by its special method in hot metal, to run the line of print very simply. And it had totally control. So our grandfather had a lot of responsibility, and I believe he took more responsibility still as he got older. Now, since one got involved with this family tree, I'm afraid I don't like to let stones remain unturned. And so I've been in touch with the Linotype company, as it now is. It's a small firm up in Cheshire. And they have told me, well, quite a lot of our paperwork from the early days is held in the museum. And they gave me the address. And so with optimism, I wrote to this museum thinking they would give me all I wanted to know. No, I got a very nice letter back from the lady in charge to say, we have got information on that company. You're very welcome to come any time within the 2 days a week that we're open. And I telephoned her, and I said, how much information have you really got to go through? She said, we have 90 boxes of papers here. Subsequent correspondence with the company secretary, as part-time as he now is, disclosed that he has another load of paper. So you can begin to appreciate that Linotype had importance, and it was basically only outdone by the computer, which enabled printing to be done so much more quickly, and it's now just a shell. But in the World War II, when I was young, my father was in the Royal Air Force, and I was seconded with my mother and sister to a quiet country seaside town in East Yorkshire, where, when I look back now, I realise how idyllic life was, whilst another part of the world was in terrible trauma. On return, however, from the war, my father comes back, and we began what I called a campaign of visiting the relatives, his brothers and his sisters. It made it terribly interesting. They all had something specific about their interests, They were all very nice people. They had standards, even if they were living in what one might say a little less than best of fortunes. They still kept things tidy and everything went along very happily, and if jokes were guffawed at incessantly, because the Routledge family in the man are basically people who tend to have a calm approach and a sense of humour. And I think that's been very well demonstrated already today. However, meeting the people was absolutely most enjoyable. I had, of course, one or two specials. One of them was my Aunt Hilda, who was the last but one daughter in the family, whose husband was an absolutely outstanding model engineer. And to get into his workshop, was absolutely fantastic. There were the lathes, there was the model engine he was building, real true to life, a ship he was building, an aeroplane he'd started on. But above all, at the end of the day, he made an outstanding replica of an old fire engine. And that fire engine won him the gold medal that year at the Engineers Exhibition. So Goodman, is his surname? Herbert Goodman made his mark. It's just a disappointment to me that I didn't manage to get my hands on that engine when his family came to change house. Equally, my mother was pretty insistent that it was far too big for a house such as we had at that time. Meetings with Uncle Percy and Aunt Gladys were little more, because I was told, well, of course, they've got 6 children, you know, and they're busy all doing this, that and the other, and they live in Chingford and everything imaginable. But my father, I know, met with Uncle Percy, and at times Uncle Percy would go and visit his Aunt Nellie, who was from a previous generation, and it is recorded very firmly that on such visits, Keith and Bernard spent their time consuming biscuits in the kitchen. So that perhaps is part of the reason, Bernard, you look so well. The other thing I found interesting was the mode of address between the children. My father had a close association with his immediate elder brother, Norman, whom he called Old Boy. And when Father rang Norman from our home, I'm afraid as naughty children, we would sit and listen to how many old boys were quoted. But Father took little notice. It was one of those things that just flowed over the matter. Well, that's it. His sister, eldest sister Doris, was known as Doll. Well, how are things, Doll? Her husband Jim, because my father had a particular caring thought about Doris, since her husband Jim, very nice fellow, an accountant, but I believe from childhood, had had in tough times the depression that left him in put it. He then got a job, fortunately, with a bank, which went well, until war came along, as the bank itself dealt extensively with Europe. And that particular part of the business was just closed, the staff. But he found another job and he motored on to the end. And that part of the family is one I'm still trying to trace, because I can't find out Doris's date of birth, date of marriage, date of death, or for that matter, other people. But I believe...
Might be your lucky day.
In the 1950s, after I bought my first motor car, very old motor car, my father got attached to vehicles.